the last 30 years, but it's been 8 years, or no, sorry, it came during COVID. And then the kids have been for some of this.
So the cousins have all grown up.
Oh yeah, but it was very nice.
Welcome everybody. I'm Mark Hennessy. I'm the Executive Director of Chik-Wauk and the Gunfoot Trail Historical Society. And just a quick note on that, we're having a great year here. Attendance is up after a couple weeks of flooding when we weren't able to open, unfortunately, second year in a row. We've got a new exhibit that will be opening in like a week or two on we're calling it, for now at least, the Trapper Shack exhibit. And it's going to be a replica Trapper's Shack right behind the museum down right on the lake. So it's going to be very cool. You'll want to see that for sure. And as you know, we're a nonprofit organization, and we function solely on donations and the goodwill of the community. We don't get government funding. And so feel free to make a donation if you'd like. We also get these events sponsored by Visit Cook County, so they are a really incredible partner for us too. So, and I get to introduce our speaker today, Timothy Cochrane, and I learned a number of things. Mostly, he's a humble guy, first of all. I know that, so I learned a lot of these from his wife. He's a St. Paul native, but has had a career in the National Park Service, and spent some time in Alaska working with the indigenous populations there, and a regional a role as an archaeologist in Anchorage, actually, and did that I think I heard 7 years or something. And then moved on to Grand Portage to become the superintendent. And because he had done a lot of work with the native populations, Grand Portage at that time was considering sort of a joint management arrangement with the Grand Portage Band. And that happened, and it is now considered a model for the Park Service. And thanks to the good work of our speaker. He's written, I think, a total of 3 books. We've got 2 that are for sale today. He will sign them for you if you'd like, and I'm holding them both up. The talk is primarily going to be on making the carry. We also have, I got to say this slowly, I always mispronounce it. Maybe I should have you, can you pronounce it the way I should be pronouncing it?
Gichi, Bitobig.
Gichi, Bitobig. Okay, excellent. That's how I would have said it. So these are available. And he also has written one on Isle Royale called Minong. We don't have that yet, but we're going to try to get that for our gift shop. Obviously, after we're done, there'll be question and answers time period, and you're welcome to again, come up to the museum and check out all the things that are going on there. So, with that, Timothy, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming on a nice day. It's great that you're here. So what I'm going to do today is just show you a few slides to give you kind of an introduction and talk through the slides as it would give you an introduction to the book. So when we get done, you'll have a pretty good sense of some of which is in the book. I mean, I won't have enough time to, and the book's sort of still alive for me, in the sense that there's still lines of inquiry that I'm still looking at. So, and I've now given, the kind of the book talk a few times, and their relatives, the Linklater descendants, have come. And so they've added stories, some of which are too good to be probably in the book, but so everything's still kind of in my head and percolating. So I do really appreciate questions, because sometimes that prods me into certain areas that I wouldn't go to otherwise. So you can help me out by asking questions. So, and I'm going to start really, as you're looking at the first slide, with just kind of how this book came about in the sense of how it was possible. The Linklaters, as you can see on the left-hand side, John and Tchi-Ki-Wis Linklaters, made, one of the things about them is they were good at making friendships, at having friends. And they were oftentimes making friends across into, into white people, into people that were very well educated, sometimes people that had a fair amount of money, but not always. Like his game warden boss became a friend, and they started a commercial fishery on Royale together. So he was, but the reason I bring this up is the book wouldn't have been possible without these friendships, because what happened was these people would oftentimes write down vignettes about what happened with Linklater or with Tchi-Ki-Wis. In the case of a woman who became a very close friend of Tchi-Ki-Wis, Ellen Hansen, she spent almost 4 months on a 4-acre island on Isle Royale with Tchi-Ki-Wis, and they didn't share a common language, and yet they became very close friends. So, I mean, there was all kinds of communication that was going on other than English, which is kind of wonderful to think about. And it's also going to be, since the story, we'll get to it, about artwork, but and craft work, and in the center lower part is pretty good examples of it. These were actually postcards that you could buy in Ely in the day. I get to use this. This is Clara Linklater, and she made all these. And it's really quite interesting. And it was during the time during Babe Ruth and the fur coat phase. And there's an irony in this, is at this point, I'm quite sure that that's probably beaver, and it was illegal to trap beaver at the time, and her husband was arresting people who were trapping beaver at the time. So there's kind of a turnaround's good play here, where suddenly these are very expensive, but yet the game warden, the indigenous game warden, is making a beaver coat and wearing it during the time. You learn as you do things, as you research, and I love this little pointer. We may never advance to the next slide, but so somebody told a grandson that this kind of design was a Cree design, it was geometric. Cree people, indigenous people way up north. Not true. It's just a different kind of beadwork. It's done on a loom rather than a free stitch. So that's why it's geometric. So my education happened while I'm doing this book as well. So, all right. And this is the sister of John that became kind of a, she ended up marrying into a Boyce Fort family, and she's quite well known in her own right, but no one ever had pictures of Mary Alice Linklater, who eventually ended up marrying a Wakemup. And if you're familiar with that part of the world, there is actually a Wakemup Bay. I think it's off of Vermilion Lake somewhere. Okay, so who were these people? Just trying to get you oriented who they were. John was born basically in 1870. Of course, there's no birth record of that. It's what I've been able to kind of tease out. And then he dies very dramatically. He drowns in Basswood in July 1933. Tchi-Ki-Wis, her English name was Helen Robinson. Was born again sometime around 1872, and she died about 15 months after her husband, and died of this is the official broken heart. She said something pretty revealing once where she lost her daughter, one of her daughters, when the daughter was 20, and she said it was much harder losing her husband than her daughter, which I thought, oh, okay. I don't know how you would assess that, but a good part of the book, so down here on the lower, I mean to do that. I was trying to do the pointer. The book spends a fair bit of time tracing John and the Linklaters' roots, and we'll see some maps coming up. But the Linklaters were poor Arcadians from Orkney, and they ended up like so many Orkney people, either whalers, seamen, or working for the Hudson Bay Company. And they could make almost 3 times as much money working for Hudson Bay Company than they could staying at home. So guess what? A lot of the men left, and a lot of them ended up working for Hudson Bay Company. If you have questions, go ahead and ask them as we're going along. There's all these apocryphal stories that we kind of have to sift through about how much reality there is. And looking at this dog was, John named the dog Minong. And this is in the early 1920s. It's just after the movie came out, which is an interesting affirmation of indigenous roots. But supposedly, this is where you get it. People say that his lead dog was half German Shepherd and half wolf. And I don't know about that, but that's what they said. So why bother? Why get interested in these folks? Well, both of them were extremely just remarkable people. There's just kind of no ways of splitting. John was basically in this part. If you were in this part of the world, and he would come over as far as Poplar Lake and the Cook County, Lake County line. So he was coming this direction. What people used to say, he was the greatest, most knowledgeable woodsman they had ever seen, period. And there's examples of that too. I find it was very interesting where he became one of a game warden, but you have to remember he was an indigenous game warden, and he's mostly arresting white men. And at that time, that was not an easy thing to be doing. He was shot at, he had his canoe destroyed, a number of things, but he was also very good at it. He was very patient, and usually if you pinched somebody, you usually been watching them for hours, so there was no disagreement about whether something had really happened or not. If you see the book, in his later life, he ends up basically being a colleague for, I can count 15 different scientists, University of Michigan, University of Illinois, University of Minnesota, and a whole bunch of other folks. So they were all looking for him to do botany. In one instance, he helped a guy do parasitology, which I thought, and it was porcupine parasitology. There's a rare knowledge base. And then he became kind of in the background for conservation work that we've all profited from. And probably the best example of that is that he became a mentor for Sigrid Olsen. Sigrid Olsen and John would travel at least 6 times that I can document, and probably quite a few more than that. So, and Sig was just a young man then. So he was just trying to get his confidence. He hadn't been a successful writer, and then he's hanging out with this John. Tchi-Ki-Wis, on the other hand, if you know if you know much about Anishinaabe culture, she was a Midi-Wilian practitioner, which means it's a healing, traditional healing, right? Mostly based on botany, on plants. And that you'll see evidence of some of her skill related with plants as well. But she was sought after that way. And I have the names here. Some of you who are from this part of the world may recognize, Blackstone, caribou, or ottertail. Those are all families, Croix families that started coming in this way. And that's where the Powells come from, by the way. So if you know the Powell Sophie was a granddaughter of Blackstone. So there's they're whole related along the border. Yeah.
Jim, on the previous slide, you used the term Métis.
Métis?
What qualifies, what mixes are that and what are not? I've always been confused about who that label applies to accurately.
Well, that's a really good question. And if we were doing this if we were in Atikokan or Moose Factory or in Winnipeg, there's fighting words related to this. So in the book, I take a pretty conservative view of what Métis means. And what Métis, in my mind, is there were actually two different bodies of Métis. The ones that most of us are probably familiar with would be Anishinaabe women marrying white guys, or maybe not marrying, but having a mixed blood child that usually knew French, usually was Catholic, and oftentimes had, if the family goes back, relations with worked for the Northwest Company, the Grand Portage Company, if you will. The Linklaters were what's known as Scotch Métis, and so that's where the Orkney came up, and the Scotch, and they're marrying Cree women or having children from Cree women. So this is a little further north, Hudson Bay. And where this gets dicey, Jim, is that what's happening in Canada right now is everybody is broadening the topic. And the reason they're broadening the topic is now, just recently through court decisions, Métis are now recognized as Indigenous people in Canada. In fact, there was just recently a squabble between First Nation and the Métis group, because if Métis suddenly had treaty rights in X area, how would that impact the First Nation kind of thing? A lot of people are getting, a lot of people are making that term very expansive, but the legal side of it is generally it's a group of people that not just are mixed bloods, but they had their own culture, they had their own flag, they had their own language. Linklaters, or Jack anyway, probably spoke what was known as Bungi. It's now a lost language. And same with the French Métis, if you will. They had mischief, I think is how you pronounce it. But they had their own language, self-governing, own artwork. Some of you probably know about Métis fiddling. There was a whole culture that came out, a different kind of music style, different kind of artwork. And they fought 2 wars against Canada and lost twice, unfortunately. Self-governing, they had their own government, and they got run over by the Canadians. So Métis they take a really narrow view of it, but then right now, like I have a friend in Thunder Bay, and he's calling himself Métis, and I don't know about that. Is that confusing, or is that?
Fascinating. Thank you.
Well, what's interesting about that is, and there's a little bit about this in the book, is it makes you realize how arbitrary racial categories are, right? I mean, it's just, they're absolutely bonkers when you think about it. Okay, yeah, and so just where we were, these folks were all, if we were around here 70, 80 years ago, we'd be running into these folks. So the Linklaters were related to they were called the boundary waters, Ojibwe, or the people that lived along. And the thing that happens with Anishinaabe people back in a bit more traditional times is men would generally marry outside of their band. So let's say if I was from Croix, I would probably try to marry somebody from Seine River or Grand Portage or Bois Forte. So you talk about somebody being Croix, but that person's mom is probably from Bois Forte and dad is from Croix. So there's this knowledge base that's much wider than we might think of.
Why was that that they married outside of their own group? Is it a genetic thing?
I'm not sure I know the real answer. I mean, where does a real strong cultural predisposition come from? You know, I just don't know. They're also marrying outside of their clan. So if I was Caribou clan, I would not be looking for a spouse who's Caribou. She would be something else. So I really, why that came from. What's also interesting about at least kind of the values there is, in those days, very accepting of men coming into the area and then being part of that group. So Jack is from way far north, really, if you want to think of it that way. But he marries Tchi-Ki-Wis from Croix, and then he's accepted in Croix. Tchi-Ki-Wis's father actually was from way over east of the Sault Ste. Marie, and he came up this way during the building of the Dawson Trail. That's always a great. Who here knows about the Dawson Trail? Sue's waving her hand, sort of.
A little bit.
Okay, so the Dawson Trail is something this is really interesting to me, because if I was in the audience and I got this question, my hand would be. So during the first war with the Métis, Canada had a problem, right? They had to get their soldiers from out east to basically Winnipeg or Red River at the time. And guess what us Americans did? We said, no way, Jose, you can't go on our railroads, because the U.S. had some designs on wanting the prairie provinces for themselves. So Canada had to build a road. And they had to build a road. They could get their troops up to Thunder Bay, right, on the Lake Superior. But then they had to get it so they had to hack this road, I think it's like 640 miles through the boreal forest. And it all happened basically in like 3 years. And in the book, this is a pretty good analogy. I call it the Canadian equivalent of the Oregon Trail, except with canoes. Because and there was actually steamships too, but that's what the Dawson Trail was, and that brought Tchi-Ki-Wis's dad from Sault Ste. Marie, because they hired a bunch of indigenous people to come and work to hack this through. But basically, it goes right through the Quetico. If you draw a line, you kind of know the shape of the Quetico, right? You go from the northeast end all the way down to the southwest end. That's where the Dawson Trail went right through there. So the Canadians had their big Western Trail right through our part of the world. And why I didn't know about that when you're growing up. And if you guys have ever canoed in Quetico, you can still make out some of these places. There's a place called Pine Portage. Has anybody been to Pine Portage besides my wife and I? There's the hulk of the steamship still in the water. Man, you can see the cylinders, and then they came down to Moline, and they came down right by Croix. So it went from basically what's now park headquarters right through the Quetico. Anyway, that's the Canadian history for the day. Yeah, well, I have the wrong slide to show you. The book, there's a map of the actual trail. And this to me is the most important map in the whole book, and of course the press decided to compress it. But the reason why, so you guys all know where Croix and Basswood is, right? The importance of this is there's indigenous people everywhere here. You know, we think of the Boundary Waters being, you know, nobody living around. It's been created. So you got people down here, Vermilion Lake, you got the Burnside people, the boys sporting at Lake, not too far there. You got the Croix people. And then for extra credit, you have the Kawa Bay people. Oh, I got this. This is great. So, and the other sad part of this thing is the Kawa Bay people, their reserve was extinguished by the province of Ontario, totally illegally, 1910, 1914. So there would have been a reserve right in the middle of the Quetico, but it was just out the door. And what happened was most of the people from Kawa Bay ended up down in Croix. And there's one horrible instance where they were forced in the winter, just with winter coming on, by gunpoint for Indian people to Croix. So it was not a kinder or gentler situation. The Linklaters place is on Jackfish Bay, is right in there. Jackfish Bay is, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Anishinaabe Moan name there, but what it means is it's where set lines used to be set up in the winter time, where they were going after jackfish or northern pike. And so apparently there was a lot of northern pike, and if you went there at the time, there was all these flags sticking out of the ice. And sometimes if they're catching something, they're waving. And that's where the name of the lake comes from. This was the wild rice at the time, Linklaters' time, is the darkish stuff on the map. Yeah, and so the Linklaters families show up in Fort Albany, don't want to do a map of Orkney, it'll be over there. But they end up, and then through the book they come down the Albany River and then down this way, and they end up down there in St. Andrews and Winnipeg. And then John's dad and his sister and him ended up coming back this way. Most of the Métis, after the big fights, went that direction. They went to the northwest, so it was very unusual. But it just gives you an idea of the expanse. And so Linklater was really born on Lake on Lac Seul. I don't know if you've all been to Lac Seul or not. It's a big, long lake, and it's dammed up now. So it used to be just a widening of the river. But he was born there, and basically they're operating their whole lives in this region right here. And the Linklaters' first child was born on Poplar Lake. The Poplar House, and all that. So they were over this part of the world. I threw this in. This is more or less the Cree indigenous world. And this was a painting done by Jack's great uncle, who has a whole distinguished career. His name was William Richards, died when he was very young, but he's one of the first visual indigenous artists in this part of the world. And so what he's painting is a Cree couple coming back with a load of partridges in it. And what's interesting is this is a very peculiar, the Cree women had a very peculiar headgear that you could always tell. So you could always tell whether the difference between Cree and Anishinaabe people by their headgear. So I found stuff all over the place. There was photographs in the National Archives, Harvard, British Columbia, Hudson Bay Company Archives in Winnipeg, Library and Archive Canada. This one's from Harvard, and this is something somebody who's really ambitious here should be thinking of doing. So David Bushnell, but he was actually from, speaking of which, from St. Paul, but he was paid by museums of the day to go around and go on trips and collect things, hopefully paid for them. And he did a Hunter's Island trip, Hunter's Island being basically the Quetico, in 1899, and his journals have never been published. So if anybody's looking for a document that you'd like to work on or see it go into print, and he's got, I'm going to make this up because I didn't count, maybe 40 photographs to go with it. So, but that's out there to be done. Talked a little bit about John being a sought-after guide. He guided, even when he was working, he worked for Swallow and Hopkins Lumber Company. He was known as the Scotch breed guide. That's how gentle and kind people were then, and racist to boot. But this is a picture, and you probably can't read this, but he met a Potawatomi Indian on Isle Royal, and so they had this exchange going on where this Potawatomi Indian is speaking to John, and John is speaking back to him, and those languages are almost understandable. They're that closely related. So Linklater did some of this guiding, and oftentimes for important people. The one on the right was a doctor, medical doctor from New York City named Frank Hostler, and he's the guy that Uncle Sam sent out to see if Isle Royale was worth it to be a national park. And guess who they got to guide him? Jack. Jack's about 60 when he's sitting on that stack. And then down here in the lower left, he oftentimes became quite close friends with Alice and Frank Warren. Frank Warren was a big iron range, iron mine owner, and Alice became the first woman regent of the University of Minnesota. So that was kind of people he was hanging out with. She was from Duluth originally. And I mentioned the Sigrid Olsen thing, and this even gets even better than if you can, I don't know if you can read it way in the back, but basically the upshot of this is Sig Olsen's in school at the University of Illinois. He got a master's degree in doing research on wolves. And while he's there, Aldo Leopold asks him who should guide him. And Sig Olsen's recommending do whatever you can, do everything in your power to have Jack Linklater guide you. Now, does it get any better than that? And Aldo, Sig Olsen saying that to Aldo Leopold. And this is actually, I wish you guys could see this better, but this is actually something that I have been thinking about. But let me just explain what's going on for those of you who have not seen this in the book. But the red lines here is Sig Olsen's doing his master's thesis, and he's trying to figure out wolves and coyotes, actually. And so what does he do? He takes a map and he asks John, write down wolf trails that Jack knows. And there's a few things that come to my mind when I see something like this is, how can you do that? I mean, how can you have that kind of geographical reference and be able to be that specific? What kind of mind does it take to do that? Well, you're supposed to have a photographic mind, but this is where like I said, I'm starting to think a little bit more. There's some indication that some indigenous people, memory is organized spatially rather than temporally. Think of your own memories where you think about things and you think about events that occurred when you were 7 years old, or in the old house where you grew up, or when you went you know, when the first time they left home. We tend to break them up into events that, while we may not assign a year to them, that's how we break them up, right, chronologically? Is that, there's some indication that's not how some indigenous people remember things in their long-term memory. They're adding things spatially. So what is happening in sag? Well, not just sag when I first caught my first walleye, but sag in my entire lifetime of what, you know, how long I've been here. And then you have something that's spatially organized rather than temporally organized. And I got to thinking that's about the only way you could do this. Because how in the heck are you going to remember the specifics of, you know, seeing a wolf trail way over at the western edge of the boundary waters, and then be way over, I mean, this is not too far from where we're sitting here, you know, right there in Sag. He's remembering a wolf trail there. I mean, how many of us can do this? And there's something else going on there where you're remembering that kind of thing. Try to do this. This is not a mental map. And maybe you guys have seen people draw mental maps, like if you grew up in St. Paul, and, you know, as a kid, you know, you remember certain things, where the state fair is, or you remember where the Capitol is. You know, we're talking hundreds of miles here, and specifics through time. John's probably about 60 when he drew this. I just find that just stunning. So the Linklaters and the Warrens got pretty involved in Isle Royale related stuff. And there was kind of an interesting moment between Isle Royale and where we are right now. In the 20s, it's right when brainworm just started to occur in this part of the world, and it was just starting to affect moose. And so moose numbers were dropping rather dramatically. And people would sometimes see, there's one account in Cook County of a trapper going out and seeing 11 dead moose on one survey line. So the numbers, people, if you read the newspapers, there's this thought that moose are on their way out, basically. They're dropping. Nobody knows why, because nobody diagnosed this brainwave for a long, long time. And on the other hand, Isle Royale moose numbers are just climbing through the roof. And so the few people that were interested in this was, well, what's going on? How come something so close? So what Frank Warren and Linklater decided, well, let's go out and study moose, right? This is like citizen science in 1926. That's what it was. And what did they do? They used a typical guiding thing that you would happen if you were here. What would a guide do in the 1920s if you saw a moose? You chase it, so you get your clients closer to the moose and have a real good time, right? That's what you do. You chase moose. So that's what they just, basically, they're chasing moose, and so they're trying to detect the health of the moose and how they respond. They're trying to keep track of them, but they get into like 300 and they realize they're not sure if they're seeing the same moose or not. There's a little bit of a problem that way. But so anyway, this is the first woman regent of the University of Minnesota, not paddling, but sitting in the canoe. And they stacked some brush up there, and this is Jack paddling as fast as he can to get, and then Frank Warren is on the side with a movie camera, a still camera, and they're trying to chase the moose right at it. That's science in 1926. And here they're getting a little bit closer. And that's the roles are reversed. And that's probably, Alice is probably taking this picture. And this canoe still exists. It's the last really large thing in the Linklaters of any large size. So it's kind of.
Where is that canoe?
It's Isle Royale has it, and so it's actually in the Keweenaw, Michigan. Yeah, it's a very bizarre canoe. It's birch bark, and then it's covered with canvas. And when Carl Galway reviewed the book, he called me up with friends, and Carl was up always for Anishinaabe from the Ely area, and he said he just started laughing because he said his parents did the same thing. They were trying to marry wooden canvas technology with birch bark technology, and Carl said his parents wrapped it, they got the canvas, they wrapped the birch bark, and then they put some sort of carpet rope around it. He said it was the worst canoe he had ever been in. So the other thing that's happening at the same time, just almost uncannily parallel with the Linklaters, is this is the time when caribou was pooping out in our part of the world, both on Isle Royale and this part. Linklater liked to take his clients to where he knew he could find caribou antlers or caribou hair. And in this case, he and Alice have found what some have said is the last caribou antler on Isle Royale. Jack particularly was a prankster. There's a number of stories in the book about things that he did. And in this case, he guided, this is kind of almost hard to respond to, but he guided these two rich guys from Chicago, and I mean rich guys, who had their own yachts. And there was supposed to be a third vessel that was supposed to join them, and they didn't make it. The third vessel didn't make it there. But I'm telling you, this is actually true. The name of the vessel was the Swastika, to give you an idea of some of the dynamics that's in the air at the time. But anyway, the two leaders of this, McDonald Massey, ended up giving Jack the top hat as a gift, and then it gets turned around and used by his father-in-law and Tchi-Ki-Wis where they're clowning around. I don't think he knew how to play the mandolin there either. They're just screwing around. I think this is my favorite photograph of Linklater, that little kid. Just found out, I don't know if you've been in dialogue with Camp Widgie-Wagon, if you're familiar with the Y camp over. We were trying to figure out where the name came from, and it's a pretty good chance that it came actually from Linklater. It's a distinguished camp that St. Paul kids often go to. And there's records of him going through there. So he's associating with Boy Scouts, campers, that kind of thing. So if he was alive today, he would have been at Minong, kind of thing. And I want to turn just a little bit to Tchi-Ki-Wis and some of her artwork, just to give you a bit of a sample. But this is the largest mat that she made. It's a cedar bark mat. It's from the inner bark of cedar, white cedar. And then she dyed with just natural dyes. This one is roughly 8 by 6 feet. I mean, it's a little shy of 6 feet. So it's quite large. And with these are very common. The Powells would have been making these. In fact, there is one of the Powell daughters' mats in the Smithsonian, which I found out. But when these folks were mobile and they're moving around before the reservation period, when they're putting up their structures and it's cold out, right, you need something to insulate you from the cold ground. So that was the original origin of these mats. And then after basically Indians were put in cabins, whether they wanted to be or not, then these became, for a while, sold as art pieces. And in quite a number of counties, you know how we still have the Cook County Fair? There used to be a competition for these mats in the early 1920s in Cook County. And when they're guiding, oftentimes it was about moose. And then if you liked it, then Tchi-Ki-Wis would make you a little bit of a special moose call. That's what that is. And she was also quite good with porcupine quills. And that's really all I wanted to show you right now. You guys have been patient. And I'm just going, but I want to make sure there was time for questions or comments, because I kind of introduced you to a whole bunch of things. Oh, one last thing about the cedar mats, just for kind of regional pride's sake. But when I started looking into the cedar mats, what became evident is that we're in basically the capital of this traditional art form. That there was more cedar mats made in this part of the world than, at least by what's left in museums, than anywhere else. So this is an indigenous art craft somewhere in between that really, you want to talk about something that's endemic or from where we sit right now, this probably would be it. And there are some good signs that there's some efforts now. It's mostly a lost art, but there are some efforts to try to teach Anishinaabe kids how to make these again. But it's really kind of a, I've done a lot of museum crawling online and going to a fair amount. We have the largest collection here right in our neighborhood. Grand Portage National Monument has the largest collection anywhere in the world. And it's just the kind of thing that was done. The other thing, just to kind of on a wow factor, most of these mats, remember it's 8 by 6. So you harvest the bark, you bake it into strips, generally about a ½ inch to an inch. You dye them, get them all ready, you get a frame ready to go. So the frame, this is not too far off on size. And then the weaving was generally done in one day. Oh my God. And the reason it was done in one day is because, go think about the bark, it gets dry. So you have to work it while it's pliable. So most of these things, and then that's where I got to be thinking about, think of that. Some of you are probably weavers here that can remember patterns, but if something's 8 feet by 5 feet and you're doing that, really pretty quickly, you've got to have all those patterns and 2 over 1. You got to get that right all in one day. So anyway, there's a lot of skill, but also a lot of knowledge. Yes.
Are these on display in Portage?
No. Well, there is one on display in Portage, but here's my problem. Ask them to put it on display. Because they're hesitant, and it would be a big deal. Some of them are in pretty tough shape, so they'll need to be stabilized. But again, it's people just kind of need to demand this. I want to see these mats, and the descendants of the Linklaters, I'm hoping they're the ones that lead the charge to say, hey, people need to see these.
Approximately how many do you think they have?
Oh, I can tell you exactly how many they have. There are 11 mats that Tchi-Ki-Wis made, and there are 10 more that were made by Grand Portage people, so there's 21. And one of the mats is at the Science Museum. And this is where you get, I don't know how many people deal with museums or not, but I tried to get a good picture for it for the book, and I got a crummy picture from them. And then I asked them, well, have you ever displayed it? And they, no. And you just have it. It's down in the collection storage, so sometimes you just have to ask, and you just have to say, hey, I understand we got something important here, I'd like to see it.
So are they also large?
Some of them are smaller. Some of them are quite, how would you say, they're rectangular, but they're quite a bit longer than wide.
Like a runner?
Yeah, it would be like a runner kind of thing. So they're all different size, they're all different designs, and not one of them is the same. So yeah, they're pretty interesting. They're also, there's one telltale of it. If you can see it in the picture in the book, but so Tchi-Ki-Wis is making these at Isle Royale, and we know that for a number of reasons. But if you've ever been to a commercial fishery, what do they always have in excess? kind of moldy, bad, hanging up line, right? Cotton or linen or something. So she, instead of doing it with a traditional, well, traditional was burlap bags that were taken apart and strung together. She used fishing line as the edging in her. And you can see that because a couple of them are falling apart.
It's interesting to wonder if their ability to do the designs is linked related to their ability to call things that I think we were talking about before, to draw the wolf trails. It's unrelated, but I work with Aboriginal people in Vietnam, and they would be out, and, I mean, like loincloth type, be out wandering and then come tell us where they had been. And they had no written language, no maps. And I would listen and then I would look at the topo map, and their descriptions and details were absolutely perfect. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
I suspect it's lack of a written language and things that, as you said, the segmentation that we kind of create. And you're pointing, Jim, also to it's a different use of your brain in the sense that you are, basically an archive of information. So it behooves you as you get older. That's what you can offer to the younger people, right? Is that cumulative knowledge that might be hard earned, or you might have learned it just from somebody else. But, yeah.
Can you say something about Linklaters death?
Yeah.
Can you say something?
Can I say something about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Linklater died in a canoe accident, and a motorized canoe, and it was kind of a fluke. Why he died, he drowned. His body wasn't found for 3 days, which he had told his son-in-law, don't even bother looking for me if I drown for a few days, which is, he's prescient about even how to find him, and he's dead. One or two things happened. Tchi-Ki-Wis was in the canoe, and she said they hit a deadhead, and they were thrown from the canoe. And this is, a deadhead is a partially submerged pulp log. And some people say he had bruising on his. But he actually came out of the water. He told her to swim for shore. And it hit the national news. That's the other thing. I don't know how many of you people have newspapers.com, but you can find accounts of Linklater's death in Alabama. It's just mind-boggling.
Yes. This is just reminding me of some work that I did when I was working on my dissertation, and I was working with children who were younger than 10 years old, and I was doing comparative between two communities in Cincinnati. And one of the things that many of the children were from the Appalachian area in both communities. But one of the questions that I worked with them on was their mental map of how they got from home to school, how they got from when they would be going to visit grandpa or someone like that. And that, of course, was my question, but essentially the answers would come that way. When would they know when they were getting close to Cincinnati? And then what did they see in the business of going home from school? What I want to get at is that I was interested in children's intellectual and development, but particularly in their aesthetic development for an art form. And I was using their community. I was using large-scale structures as the imagery because these people probably didn't even have a calendar with a picture on it. And I'm embarrassing myself. But I did find out that different children did have better skills, and these paralleled with intellectual skills. And so this might be a hands up to Jack in that he may not have been just Anishinaabe, but he might have, first of all, had practice in the thing that he did, but also was probably quite brilliant in regard intellectually. And I don't know if that contributes to anybody, but I don't think I have a herd of people that are reading the dissertation. So the fact that that information probably is not getting particularly disseminated. But it was a fascinating study in regard to how aesthetic development, emotional development, intellectual development, that all of these things go so close to hand in hand in the children's development.
That reminds me of a story. So one of the things that Jack's friends that left accounts for us, there was kind of a small argument about whether he ever got lost, whether he was geographically, didn't know where he was. And there was a lot of people that commented on this, which is interesting in itself. Why would people feel like they'd be compelled to want to figure out whether he ever got lost or not? But I can tell you the statistics on it was about 9 out of 10 said he never did, and there was a couple that said that he did get lost. And Jack himself was asked this once, have you ever get lost? Were you ever lost in the woods, kind of thing? And his response, and I wish I could get this exactly right, was, well, if I'm really wondering where I am, I sit down and I pretend that I'm playing pinochle. And if I'm playing pinochle, what always happens, right, if you're playing pinochle or a card game, and you're playing with other people, is somebody always wants to get behind you and see what your cards are, right? Well, they'll know where we are. So that was his response is you just need to be thinking about a card game, and then somebody's going to miraculously show up and get you out if you're lost. So that was his way of dodging the question. Yeah.
Just a little comment on that same topic. I had done some work with Creed quite far north. We were talking one day and one of the elders about how to get from point A to point B. And one of the elders pointed out to me that you, my man, think of everything from an aerial view perspective. We see everything linear. So when they would describe a trail, let's, we move forth where the sun sets until there's this big rock, so forth. It has a landscape all laid out in line on a linear perspective. So I thought it was really interesting. And then as I traveled with them, you could see that happening.
Yeah. We were talking about this in the car on the way up, and Jeannie was asking, my wife was asking me a couple questions. And the thing that's interesting about Linklater is, so I get what you're saying, but when he's a game warden, and we do have some of his game warden notes, and he's arresting somebody for illegally fishing or something like that, they, to appear in court, apparently, they had to have the section line, the township and range. So on every one of these, and there's only a few in his record books that are there, there's actually the way we would think, if you will. And I guess that's something that I really haven't talked about too much, is that he was able to live in both worlds and be quite comfortable. But if it came to, quote, arresting somebody, he could do that if that was required. Yeah.
Perfect segue, you haven't mentioned the title.
Oh, making the carry? Yeah, so making the carry, you write a book and then you got to start thinking about, what's the title going to be, right? And the book generally takes you places that you didn't know you were going to go. And one of the places was finding Linklaters so much, and if you're a Sigrid Olsen reader, I don't know if you are or not, but all but one of his books mention Jack Linklater. So I don't think anybody shows up probably to the degree of frequency. So that tells you something right there. And the best the best example of that is where he is at Twin Portage on the Moline River, and Linklater, he was a teacher, so he particularly wanted to teach white people about indigenous beliefs and crap. So there'd be times when, quote, and it sounds, he would hear spirits talking. And in fact, one of the things was his frustration trying to teach Sigurd Olson that you could hear spirits. And Sigurd Olson's not hearing anything. And then finally they get to Twin Portage and the Moline River, and Jack says he's hearing these spirits, and Sig finally says, well, I think I hear something, and could it be Indians and voyagers making the carry? And that's when then I started going back, and making the carry was an old-timey word for portaging. Yeah. Yeah, Sig Olson was not quite the best student sometimes, so he tried, I guess. And Jack knew, he wouldn't even tell us about hearing things with his game warden folks. And you want to talk about kind of a hard-boiled bunch of people that aren't going to take to indigenous spirits flying around here, there, and yon. It's probably a game warden. So, but he tried. He would give it a good go.
Yeah. You mentioned that one person spoke Potawatomi and the other speaking Ojibwe.
Yeah.
Are those both subsets of the Algonquin language?
Yeah. And in fact, Anishinaabe is oftentimes used as kind of the parent for both Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwe. So, and they split rather late, but their languages did evolve. Just as, and I think I talked about this about the Gichi book, but when we talked about the Border Lakes people, they had their own dialect too. So there was, some linguists are arguing about how many Anishinaabe dialects there are, most say 5. The Border Lakes dialect was actually one of the smallest numerically, and probably the only people still speaking it is the Croix people. But it would be Fort William, Grand Portage, people here, Croix, Seine River, and into Rainy Lake. And what that tells you about dialect is that you guys just turning around what you know about dialect. It means that there's some level of stability of marrying within that group, right? Because if you're a Yankee, like supposedly I am, and I married, my mother's from Arkansas. If I had married an Arkansas woman, who knows how I would have been speaking, but I probably wouldn't be speaking the same way. So the Border Lake people were really, I don't want to make it sound like they're too distinct, but there was right along where these cedar mats were made is a dialect, a different kind of dialect. And the Cree comment, probably some of you have heard Cree being used different ways. Cree, sometimes in this part of the world, just meant an Indian from Canada. There's confusion that way. That took me a while to figure out. And then some people have used Cree to talk about Ojibwe, the mixing of the Cree and Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people. And then there's actually the Cree people further, I'm not sure where you were, but Moose Factory and Albany and all that's a Cree speaking area. Not to get into language too much. Well, any last comments, questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.